Hello. All right, good. We good, Lisa? Okay, cool. All right, this is very bright. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. If I could see you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron Pratt, the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts here at UT Austin's Harry Ransom Center. As my title may suggest, my rent and this collection of medieval scissors that I have at home are funded by the same generous endowment from the Pforzheimers that supports this annual lecture, the acquisitions I make as a curator, a number of the fellowships that we offer each year, and some digitization, among other things. Having these resources available to support the specific collections that I oversee as curator is invaluable, and I can't thank the Pforzheimer Foundation enough for having set up that endowment many years ago. And I trust that you, like me, will enjoy seeing this endowment at work tonight. So I want to make it quick so Jane can talk. Dr. Jane Raisch is a lecturer in Renaissance and Early Modern Literature in the Department of English and Related Literatures at the University of York in the UK. She has published articles in English Literary History, also known as ELH, LIAS, the Journal of Early Modern Intellectual Culture and Its Sources, and a chapter in Minor Epic, The State of Play, from the Art and Shakespeare series. She currently has an edition of Christopher Marlowe's Complete Poetry, co-edited with Andras Kisheri, under review with the 21st Century Oxford Authors Series. Her book, Fictions of Scholarship, Humanism and Hellenism in Early Modern England, is also currently under review with Oxford. Like me, Jane has been a fellow in the Mellon Fellowship of Scholars in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School and is currently a senior fellow in that fellowship's sequel, the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. And I should mention, stay tuned, by the way, for a public panel here by other SOFCB fellows on bibliography at the Borders in May of this year. Jane has held fellowships at the Special Collections at the University of California, Los Angeles, the Huntington Library, the New York Public Library, the Bibliographic Society of America, the Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California, Berkeley, the Mabel MacLeod Lewis Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and the 25th Anniversary Sharp Fellowship. And with that, let's welcome fellowship-winning wizard Jane Raisch, who will be speaking with us on the paradox of original copies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for that very generous introduction. And I just want to say how honored I am to have been invited to speak with you here today and how much I'm looking forward to that. And I really wanted to thank Aaron and to thank everyone at the Harry Ransom Center for making my visit possible. Everyone's been incredibly generous, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you today on an ongoing project that's sort of trying to think about, exactly as Aaron put it, the paradox of the early facsimile. It is symptomatic of scholarship on the facsimile that one of the first sustained academic considerations of the topic, in an article from 1943 by Frank Weitenkampf, was simply titled, quote, "What is a facsimile?" question mark. If scholars can agree on anything about the facsimile, it might just be its indefinability, its status as perpetually ambiguous. To theorize the facsimile is to revisit over and over its most basic definition. Just what are facsimiles for? Asked the music historian John Wagstaff at the start of his merciless 2004 review of the Brood Trust series of critical music facsimiles. The questioning, if not skeptical, tenor of discussions around the facsimile seem to reflect not only an ambivalence toward facsimiles as objects, this is something Joseph Dane has thought about, but also an ambivalence created by facsimiles and their necessarily doubled, even duplicitous nature. Facsimiles are, after all, always two things at once, a book that is both its own book and also a different book. For this reason, facsimiles have not always been kindly received in certain bookish circles. For John Carter and Nicholas Barker encapsulate this anxiety vividly in their lexicon, ABCs for book collectors, which offers a single entry for facsimiles and fakes. A facsimile is a copy of some object, a leaf or a whole book, so accurate as only to be distinguishable from its original by careful observation. It figures frequently in the nightmares of collectors, causes booksellers more trouble than almost any other factor in their business, and has been known to upset the studious equanimity of librarians. For an exact copy is a menacing thing to those who pursue originals. Here, facsimiles seem to run the perpetual risk of unseating the original from its place of primacy. The underlying assumption is that facsimiles are incompatible with originality, definitionally opposite to the original, and therefore, by extension, not objects to be venerated or collected. Indeed, facsimiles here seem to not just not be originals, they are anti-originals, a challenge to the very idea of the original. In their interpretation of the facsimile, Barker and Carter appeal to the closest thing that exists to a standard definition of the facsimile: exact copy. And you'll see here that this remains the definition in both the Oxford English Dictionary and Webster. But even this idea of exact copy has proven woefully inadequate. And it's rather a bizarre phrase if you just sort of think about it for more than 3 seconds. David McKittrick has pointed out that both exactness and copy are historically contingent terms surely subject to change. While Fredson Bauer's notorious denunciation of the Yale First Folio facsimile as, quote, unsafe authority, showed that exact copies are often anything but. And he was objecting to the quality of the photographs, which, in his opinion, hindered the very scholarly investigations they were supposed to enable. The problem, in part, it would seem to me, is our somewhat impoverished bibliographic language for understanding an object that is entirely defined by its relationship to another object. How do you simultaneously associate and distinguish? Dane has compellingly suggested that facsimiles confound our categories of meaning because they confound the disciplinary boundaries of bibliography itself. They force us to confront the hazy distinctions between bibliography and textual criticism, copies and editions, even the role of materiality in bibliographic interpretation. Nowhere is this truer than in the study of early facsimiles. Facsimiles created before the advent of photomechanical reproduction, and which are the subject of my talk today. If modern facsimiles unsettle categories of classification, early facsimiles confuse them completely. Indeed, by some accounts, early facsimiles don't really qualify as facsimiles. We may not know what a facsimile is, but we certainly know what it isn't. Let me offer an example from my own research. Take this catalog entry for one of the 2 typographic facsimiles I'll be focusing on today. This is a vellum copy of a 1741 edition of the Codex Medicaeus, which is a 5th century manuscript containing the works of Virgil. This copy is held by the New York Public Library Rare Books and Manuscript Division. As you can see, a description of the book has been added to the entry, right? An imitation, not a facsimile, of the Medicean Codex. And it's interesting, of course, because I only came across this record, and indeed this book, because I was searching for the word facsimile, right? So searching for facsimile brought up a not facsimile, which I think sort of speaks to what I've been describing thus far. Let's contrast, if Aaron won't mind, this with another catalog entry from the Harry Ransom Center. This is for the exact same book, though not a vellum copy. And you'll see here that the record is really devoid of almost any clue as to what this object actually is. The words facsimile, copy, replica, reproduction are nowhere to be found. The only trace of this object's somewhat remarkable identity lies in the added authors field, where the name of the manuscript is inconspicuously included, but no further comment or explanation is offered. Though I have to say I quite like the idea of the manuscript as a kind of author of the facsimile. But I think the cataloger's conundrum here is illustrative. On the one hand, the relationship of this object to the famous manuscript is an essential part of its very identity, which somehow needs to be communicated in the record. But as I've explored, there aren't just that many ways to describe the relationship between 2 objects, so you get words like imitation. On the other hand, by our standards, this 18th century replica is a poor surrogate for the manuscript, and to call it a facsimile might mislead the unsuspecting academic researcher. At issue here is yet another form of doubleness that haunts early facsimiles in particular. Are they the subject of academic study, or are they tools for academic study? Our libraries aren't really designed for objects that might count as both. This confusion explains in part why the 1741 Virgil resides in the Rare Books Division of the New York Public Library, alongside such revered objects as a Gutenberg Bible and a Dove's Paradise Lost, while the Morgan Library, literally a few blocks away, locates the same book in their reference collection. So for these reasons, it is perhaps not strictly to bibliography, but also to new media and media studies that we might look for a more generative language to describe and discuss these objects. The concept of remediation, right, the translation or adaptation from one media to another, captures the liminal status that necessarily attends forms of material reproduction, 1 foot in old media, 1 foot in new media. As McKittrick has also argued, facsimiles aren't just tools defined by their function alone. They are also pieces of evidence for developing attitudes toward the value of material objects, vital parts of not only intellectual history, but also the history of bibliographic inquiry. We might take as obvious that the desire to produce copies of specific textual artifacts did not arise ex nihilo the moment photography was invented, and yet, very little work has been done to explore where this impulse came from and how it was technologically acted upon. By and large, histories of the facsimile, not the most exciting field, invariably begin in the 19th century, transforming the facsimile into something coterminous with the advent of photomechanical reproduction. Through this association, facsimiles before 1800 become obscure, unsearchable even, right? What's our language for finding them? Oops. And this is a reason why almost every pre-1800 facsimile I've come across has been triumphantly identified by someone as, quote, the first facsimile. So, my goal today is to begin to explore with you some examples from this neglected history, to think about how print, without the aid of photography, approached the task of depicting the material embodiment of other textual artifacts. My focus will be on facsimiles of medieval manuscripts printed in the late 17th through mid-18th century. I'll offer a brief overview of early facsimile printing before turning to two unorthodox examples. These examples don't just predate what we might think of as technologies for exact reproduction, but actually offer an alternative to exactness as the obvious object of reproduction. So they challenge some of our basic assumptions about what a facsimile might do. These facsimiles invite us to linger on the gaps between facsimile and original, between copy and exemplar. They are testaments to how the doubleness of the facsimile can be an opportunity rather than a liability. So what I'm proposing is that perhaps the best way to ask what is a facsimile is to ask first, what were facsimiles? So by far the most common kind of early facsimile was simply an engraving or woodcut, an illustration of the visual appearance of another textual artifact. And just for ease of understanding, I'll refer to these as facsimile illustrations. This species of early facsimile is also the most recognized, and therefore the most commonly identified in catalog entries. So if it is going to be cataloged, it will usually have the abbreviation Facsims in the item description. So these are the facsimiles that in some ways are the most visible, the least hard to find. One of the earliest examples of this type of facsimile illustration I've come across that would have reached a relatively wide readership is in the 1657 London Polyglot Bible, the last of the four great polyglots. It was overseen by Cardinal Walton in the wake of the restoration of the English monarchy. In the extensive front matter to the 6-volume project, we find various specimens of different alphabets, including this woodcut image of ancient Greek. It may not look like much, but this image is certainly among the earliest attempts to represent the appearance of a specific textual artifact. In this case, a Greek manuscript, in fact, one of the key manuscript sources for the Polyglot Project, and one of the most famous Greek manuscripts to reside in England at the time. The manuscript is the 5th century CE Codex Alexandrinus. There you go. And is a very old copy of the Septuagint. So as you can see, the particularities of the uppercase Greek hand, and this is very characteristic of Greek manuscripts from this period, are closely rendered. And the image is labeled to show its correspondence with the manuscript itself. So one can imagine this image sort of enabling someone to actually find this precise passage actually in the manuscript. While the inclusion of such an image might seem natural enough to us, it is relatively unprecedented in this moment. And I think there are several reasons for why facsimile illustration takes off at the end of the 17th century that I'll only be able to very briefly consider here, but I'm quite happy to think more about this with you in the questions. So one clear factor is the rise of paleography, the study of manuscript handwriting, as a discipline. It's no surprise that the earliest landmark works in the field of paleography by Jean Mabillon and Bernard de Montfaucon. Any moment now, there we go. Feature numerous early examples of engraved manuscript illustrations. This is what Scott Mandelbrot has called the, quote, evidentiary power of illustration. Illustration as a tool for establishing scholarly authority. Once the visual features of a manuscript, like the hand, are understood to offer crucial evidence for when, where, and how a manuscript was produced, illustrations naturally become essential. These facsimile illustrations are not just adornments to the text, but vital extensions of the very argument and claims being presented. In this sense, we might associate the rise of evidentiary illustration in textual criticism with the rise of evidentiary illustration in the natural sciences, something epitomized by Robert Hooke's Micrographia, printed in 1666, which made available to the first time to large audiences what insects actually looked like, by including illustrations of their appearance as seen through the first microscopes. You can see a famous image here. So printed books were becoming vehicles for what we might call readerly autopsy, right? The reader has been given a new kind of vision, an experience of seeing as much as an experience of reading. If it's not indulging in too much of a cliche, we might also see these images as engaging in a form of cultural capital. So if we go back to the example from the London Polyglot, I don't think it's a coincidence that the one Greek manuscript they chose to illustrate is also the one Greek manuscript out of the many they used that actually resided in England. And before the 1630s, England is not really known as a place where there's lots of great Greek manuscripts. So the facsimile image acts as a kind of calling card for the ascendancy of England onto the intellectual world stage, perhaps especially after a period of political turmoil, an illustration of its cultural resources. Facsimiles are often tied to acts of national pride, even nascent nationalism, as much as they are contributions to the spread of knowledge. So all of these reasons lead to facsimile illustration becoming increasingly widespread in the 18th century, in further treatises on paleography and other similar endeavors, as you can see here, interest in studying new kinds of handwriting. They range from impressive large-scale illustrations that are often included on a fold-out sheet to small illustrations nestled within the body of the text. Some are of very high quality, while others more clearly show signs of the challenge of drawing letter forms. I think you can see a little bit of an awkwardness in the attempt to render the text in this image here. This interest in including illustrations from textual artifacts was not restricted to manuscripts. Joseph Ames's famous Typographical Antiquities from 1749 included an engraving of Caxton's typeface, as well as a printed specimen of the typeface of William Caslin. But all of the examples thus far have been reproductions of only parts of other textual artifacts, fragments. What about the reproduction of an entire textual artifact, such as a whole manuscript? Here things become a little bit more complicated. To use the techniques we've been looking at thus far was simply not feasible. It would have been both extraordinarily time-consuming, labor-intensive, and expensive to render every page of a lengthy manuscript as essentially a set of illustrations. So one option to accomplish this, which might seem surprising to us, is in fact to dispense with print entirely. In fact, the word facsimile comes into English in the 17th century, but it refers not to something mechanically reproduced, but rather to handwritten copies. And sure enough, manuscript was a vehicle through which early facsimiles were made, such as this 1670s facsimile now at the British Library. This is a facsimile of the famous Vatican Virgil manuscript, a manuscript that dates to approximately the 4th century. And I've included the corresponding page of the manuscript here. As you can sort of see, but of course the actual manuscript image is very, very damaged, this manuscript was particularly famous for its vivid illustrations of Virgil's poetry. And Cardinal Camillo Massimo, who commissioned the manuscript facsimile, wanted the entire manuscript to be rendered. He wasn't interested in just the fragments and pages we've seen thus far. So what I think Massimo's facsimile reminds us is that even in the early centuries of print, reproduction was not synonymous with the mechanical. And something I really like about this example here is I think just subtly, and it gets a little bit worse as the facsimile goes on, but I think you can see that the scribe, the 17th century scribe, is a little bit unsure of exactly how to render this much older hand. I think you can see a little bit of a sense of wobble or lack of confidence. It's worth saying, of course, I don't have time to get into this in any full way, but manuscript facsimiles have a long history, dating back to the medieval period. If you're interested, Christopher de Hamel has discussed the Leiden Aratea. This is another famous illustrated manuscript from the 9th century. As a manuscript facsimile, he believes this 9th century manuscript is itself a facsimile of a lost exemplar. And for him, the question is, what kind of copying is at work here? He sees this 9th century facsimile evincing a kind of conspicuous anachronism, right? And he distinguishes this from, of course, the kind of copying that really defined all book production in the medieval period. Okay. But there were early attempts to use print technology to create facsimiles of whole manuscripts. And it's this phenomenon that I find the most intriguing. This would be a category of facsimiles broadly referred to as typographic facsimiles, since they rely on movable type to depict the material embodiment of a specific textual artifact. Now, the typographic facsimile as a concept is a slightly counterintuitive one, I think. We might think of movable type by definition as a vehicle not for rendering particularity, but for creating uniformity. The great thing about print is that a single typeface can be reused over and over again for a whole range of texts and genres. That's not to minimize the variety we see in typefaces, but just to explain part of the kind of rationale of what they can do. So the question before us might be, how can a technology invented to create uniformity be reimagined as a tool to render specificity? Okay, let's take a look at the 1741 Virgil we briefly looked at earlier. This is the imitation, not a facsimile, of the 5th century Codex Medicaeus. The volume is printed in Florence by the Mani family, probably the son, Domenico Maria. The project was overseen by Pier Francesco Foggini, an Italian archaeologist and scholar of Latin manuscripts. Unfortunately, and this is going to be a bit of a theme, I'm afraid, we don't know much else about the context for the printing of this object. But we do know that the Codex Medicaeus was and is an important early manuscript of the works of Virgil and was housed, as it still is today, in the Laurentian Library after being acquired by the Medicis in the centuries before this volume. Besides its age, the manuscript is also famous for containing a number of corrections to the text along with a subscription. That's a kind of signature, identifying the corrector as one Tertius Rufius Apronianus Asterius, an aristocrat active in the 490s. So this would be someone correcting the manuscript who was quite close in time to when the manuscript was actually produced. So essentially an ancient commentator and corrector on an ancient manuscript. So if we think back to the London polyglot and this idea of cultural capital, I again don't think it's a coincidence that a Florentine scholar printer, along with a Florentine scholar, chose to take up a project that highlighted a famous manuscript held in Florence. But the approach of Mani and Foggini is what's really fascinating. They decided to have 3 letters of the alphabet, just see here, A, U, V, and Y, specially cut to mimic the hand of the Codex Medicaeus. So if I can just show you here, right, we have a Y, right, this weird Y. We have this weird kind of U, and we have a weird kind of A. These have been specially cut to look like the hand that this manuscript was created in. The rest of the alphabet, as I'm sure you can see, was simply left in a conventional uppercase Roman font. The effect is, to me at least, a somewhat disorienting melange of the familiar and the unfamiliar, and there's certainly a whole body of work that's interested in facsimiles and the uncanny. Foligny rationalizes this process in his preface, where he appeals to practicality and the reader's generous understanding in claiming that a sampling of letter forms, and these are ones he sees as particularly characteristic, are sufficient for evoking the manuscript's hand. Alongside this explanation, he includes an image, a facsimile illustration like those we saw earlier, rendering the appearance of a few lines of the manuscript. In addition to these specially cut letter forms, Foligny also renders the manuscript's corrections, and he does this through a variety of techniques. He has used a small unseal font to print the interlinear emendations, so you can see these kind of right here and right there. And he's quite precise in the preface to say the interlinear corrections were not done in the same distinctive hand, so that's why he can use just the regular Roman font he has, not the specially cut font for the interlinear emendations. Even more remarkably, someone has gone through the printed text and crossed out the same letters and words that are crossed out in the manuscript by hand. So, moments like, let's see what I can find here, right? These lines through the T and through the R, those are done by hand. It's extraordinary if you think about how many probable copies there were made of this particular printed book. How do we know it's by hand? How do we know this was done by hand? Well, one easy way is by comparing the different styles of crossouts across different copies. So here, if we take a look at the word coupiant, right, you can see that someone's gone through and crossed out each letter individually, right? This is the New York Public Library copy. But in another copy, this is actually my copy, you see someone's gone, it's a little more faint, but someone's gone through just a single strike through, right? So a different style has been used. So of course, every printed book is a unique copy. We all know this. But there's a sense in which the uniqueness of the copies of these books is sort of incredibly amplified. But this is not all. Foligny mentions in his preface that there are also later corrections to the text that have been done in red. In fact, he even remarks that some of these corrections seem to be read over black. So, dutifully, someone has gone through and, by hand, written over the appropriate letters in red. So that's exactly what we're seeing here. Again, this is someone in hand, in red, writing over black letters to mimic this effect in the manuscript. Now we know, Foligny knew they were later, we know that these red corrections were actually Renaissance in origin. They were almost certainly done by the humanist Pomponius Laetus, so significantly later. Now, just to slightly make things more complicated, this hand-done red is distinct from the printed red, the printed rubrication, which we can see here. This is a representation of that subscription I was mentioning earlier, where it identifies the corrector. Okay. Just for reference, I've included the actual corresponding manuscript page by way of comparison. You can see it's in rather poor shape, and I apologize for the quality. This is a difficult digital surrogate to work with, speaking of surrogates. You'll also notice that the marginal notes, extensive marginal notes, have not been rendered by Foligny. And in the preface, he explains that they were too difficult to read and too badly damaged. Finally, it's useful to know that at the back of Foligny's facsimile, he has notes. These are notes which discuss manuscript variants and other textual, not really literary issues, and the notes actually continue, at least in the kind of headwords, the specially cut font. That's extended. Okay. So, in some ways, this edition is a combination of every technique for rendering facsimiles we've seen thus far. Illustration, right, that facsimile illustration meets actual handwritten manuscript intervention meets typography. Now, Foligny doesn't seem to have been the first person to think of designing letter forms to mimic the hand of a manuscript. The earliest example of this, I believe, though I'm curious if other people know of other examples, is a mysterious fragment from around 1714 that is part of the Bagford collection of the British Library. This fragment has been created not using the techniques of engraving or woodcut we've seen earlier, but by having an entire set, so not just a few letters, an entire set of types cut to mimic the hand of a particular manuscript. In this case, it's our old friend, the Codex Alexandrinus. Now, sadly, because the Bagford collection is comprised entirely of unidentified fragments, it's really hard to know anything else about this artifact. What we do know is that over 50 years after this fragment was probably printed, an almost complete typographic facsimile edition of the New Testament of the Codex Alexandrinus was printed in 1786. And this constitutes the first facsimile of an entire manuscript to be printed using a full set of facsimile types. So we're talking about every letter here. So Foggini may not have been the first to think of a project like this, but I think it's also worth saying we have no idea if Foggini had any knowledge of what was going on in London at this time. So in some ways, I think the partiality, the kind of manifest compromise represented by the Virgil facsimile, by Foggini's approach, is the more interesting one. The 1786 Codex Alexandrinus seems to me to be playing with an illusion of exactitude. I'm not saying someone would actually confuse this object with the manuscript. There are obvious indications that it's printed, but it certainly seems to be trying to offer something close to an immersive experience of that textual artifact, something we might particularly appreciate when we zoom in and examine the text closely. But in the Virgil, by contrast, this illusion is dispensed with. It's not even trying to look like the page of a manuscript particularly. It's something closer to what we might call a diplomatic transcription meets a partial critical facsimile. Now, we do today have facsimile editions that try to do several things at once. So we might have a modern facsimile that has photographs of a textual artifact with perhaps a facing transcription, and there might be an editorial apparatus. But here, those distinct components are so inextricably merged that from a modern perspective, this would fail to be any of those things, right? So in the fact that the diplomatic transcription is also the same thing as the thing that's trying to be a material facsimile, it in some ways, again, by modern standards, would sort of fail at both. So for my purposes today, we might think of this as a kind of hybrid facsimile. The hybridity of this object is further complicated by the fact that Foggini also uses his facsimile to reconstruct a missing part of the fragmentary manuscript. So the Codex Medicaeus is missing several of its initial leaves. So the text of Virgil's Eclogues, which traditionally begins Virgil's collected works, is incomplete. It begins in the middle of Eclogue 6. So Foggini includes the missing Eclogues. So there we have the nice beginning of the Eclogues that this doesn't exist in the actual manuscript as we have it and as he had it. He uses, get this, the text of the Vatican Virgil. So that's the manuscript we looked at earlier that had a manuscript facsimile made of it. He uses this manuscript for the text, but retains the facsimile's visual consistency by rendering these non-existent pages in his specially cut letter forms and with the same rubricated headings. So essentially, he's taken the text from one manuscript, but printed it so that it looks like a different manuscript. Foggini is essentially extrapolating the appearance of the missing pages from the surviving ones, and he distinguishes the additional pages from the facsimile pages by using Roman numerals for the former, so you know you're in the space of a reconstructed text if it has a Roman numeral, and if it has traditional Arabic numerals, you know you're in the actual facsimile. Okay, Foggini's instinct to complete the fragmented manuscript, transgressive as it may seem to us, was not an unprecedented scholarly move. And I think there are interesting analogs in the work being done right at this time with the reconstruction of classical sculpture and the kind of advent of archaeology, where the sense of completing classical statues was, fitfully in vogue. Scholarly editions often boasted that they offered complete or whole versions of fragmentary texts. But it is the overt material concerns of Foggini's facsimile that makes this completion feel particularly incongruous. It's not as if it was hard to get a hold of a copy of Virgil's Eclogues in the 1740s. And conversely, it's not as if you'd really want to read Foggini's edition if you were just someone trying to read Virgil's Eclogues. So part of an understanding of Foggini's motivations here may reside in the Latin word copia, which meant both copy, duplicate, and was often used, including by Foggini, as a way to talk about these kind of facsimiles, copies, but also meant plentitude or fullness. And it was an important rhetorical concept in early modern thought, and this is where we derive the English word copious. As Margreta de Grazia has described in the context of the printing of drama, the dual resonances of this term have consequences for the work of print. Replication and amplification become interrelated phenomena. To make another is also to make better. And in some ways, is this not one of the paradoxes of facsimiles writ large? That in their goal to copy something, they also often reconstruct or improve that thing in the process. I think the manuscript of the Vatican Virgil is a great example of that, in the way it just completely, vividly remade that very, very partial image. So let's compare Foggini's approach to another important example. So this is actually an early example from 1697. And it's a facsimile of a lavishly illuminated manuscript from 1400, as you can see here, one of several lavishly illuminated manuscripts sponsored by Emperor Wenceslas IV. The manuscript is of the Golden Bull of 1356. This is an important edict of the Holy Roman Empire that established crucial constitutional rights. I know almost nothing else about the Golden Bull of 1356. The book was printed in Frankfurt by Johann Melchior Benkard under the supervision of the scholar and lawyer Heinrich Gunther von Thulemeyer. And again, we don't know a great deal about the sort of circumstances that prompted the creation of this edition. Unlike the Virgil, the facsimile is only one part of a multi-part volume, right? That part, the copia, again, that's the part that's a kind of facsimile. It also contains essays on the bull. It also has a German translation of the Latin text. It refers to the facsimile as a copia, and in keeping with the emphasis we've seen on where a manuscript it is held, it both extols the beauty of the manuscript and also talks about the wonderful repository in which it can be found. The volume opens conventionally enough, with a beautiful, bold-out engraved illustration of the first folium of the manuscript, and you can see that here. Again, we're in relatively familiar territory. We saw examples of these fold-out engraved facsimile illustrations. Fine. But if you turn the page, and if you keep turning the page, we find something actually really different. Gone are fold-out pages, gone are engravings, just conventional Roman type, some woodcuts, and a weird page layout. So what's going on here? So the first page has been done as a facsimile illustration, but then the rest of the manuscript has been rendered typographically. So as you can see from the distinctive, oddly spaced double columns, which again for me provoke this feeling of slight disorientation that I'm not quite reading your average printed book, the spatial format and placements of words in the line has been carefully replicated from the manuscript, and we can actually compare directly two pages side by side, and I apologize for the quality of the manuscript image here. Other visual features of the manuscript are represented as well. Wherever the manuscript features an illuminated initial, so we have a nice example down here, the printed book inserts a printed ornamental initial. We have a nice example right there. Moreover, rubrication, so this is the coloring in red we've seen before, in the manuscript to mark chapter headings and the like are rendered as italic in the facsimile. So you can see here, this is this italic that would correspond with rubrication in the manuscript. Unfortunately, most of the manuscript isn't digitized, so you'll have to just take my word for it, that this actually represents rubrication in the manuscript, but it really does. The most exact point of correspondence comes from the illustrations. The facsimile woodcuts of the images are clearly attempting to be, dare I say, exact copies, and are situated in relation to the text and page layout in the exact same places you would find them in the manuscript. So you can see, right, a nice exact correspondence there. Okay. This is clearly a different beast than the Virgil, but I think hybridity remains a useful way of thinking about its approach to remediation. Like the Virgil, a preceding facsimile illustration sets the stage. There we have it again. The visual appearance of the textual artifact is established as closely as possible. Once this is established, the image can function, I think, as a kind of visual key in which the reader is invited to keep in mind or make a series of substitutions or correlations. So what do I mean here? So I think for Roman type, you see there, you might read a Gothic hand. For oddly blank margins and spaces, you might read these illuminated vines and plants. For ornamental initials, read illuminated initials. For woodcut illustration, read color illuminations. We might think about this set of substitutions as prompting subtle acts of translation across media. Again, coming back to this idea of what we might call remediation, moving across two different media. I think the work done by this remediation goes beyond the visual key of the opening illustration, however. I think it also relies upon what I want to think of as an implicit or assumed bibliographic literacy on the part of the reader, a literacy grounded in the visual lexica of manuscript and print, respectively. It's long been a commonplace of scholarship on the early centuries of print to highlight how this new technology remains haunted by its manuscript forebears. Print replicates many of the structures of meaning that organize the medieval book. Here, that legacy seems to be intentionally activated. Ornamental initials really are a kind of printed equivalent of illuminated initials. This sense of functional rather than visually exact equivalency is borne out in the choice of ornamental initials used in the 1697 facsimile. As far as I can tell, no attempt has been made to match the images depicted in the manuscript's illuminated initial, which is pretty hard to see here, but certainly doesn't seem to be what's going on here. What matters, it seems to me, is simply the fact of them being decorative. And I suspect the printer used whatever illuminated initials he had on hand. This happens, I think, to be a guy having his head chopped off. In fact, it happens. So the facsimile's tacit evocation of bibliographic literacy is even more clear in the rendering of rubrication. While a comparison between the manuscript and the facsimile, something that I was able to do, clearly show that italic stands in for rubrication, the rubrication is, of course, not rendered on the engraving. The engraving is in black and white. So without this direct key, the italic operates according to an implicit, not explicit, an implicit logic of analogy. What italic is to print, let's say a standard way of indicating headings and titles, rubrication is to manuscript. Now, it's an imperfect equivalency, of course. Printed italics are visual cues for more than just titles. Rubrication is certainly an available process in the late 17th century, but I still think an equivalency is what's structuring the choice to render them in this way. We might also note that the visual dimensions of the manuscript not retained in the engraving or the facsimile at all, really. So this would be the material the manuscript's made from, the binding, the colors used. These are discussed in some detail in von Thulemeyer's preface. There he explains that all chapter titles have been done in red, and he discusses the distinctive cerulean color of the love knot depicted inside the letter O on the first page. You can see that right here. This is apparently one of the emblems that appear in almost every Wenceslas IV manuscript. Naturally, in his preface, von Thulemeyer never really theorizes his own project in the way I'm trying to do today. He instead offers an overview of the great labor that went into creating this volume, and that's a pretty conventional thing for 17th century prefaces to do. He describes how he instructed the compositor to pay close attention to the layout of pages and lines, and the effort he went to secure engravers of the highest quality to make the opening image. However, he does offer one gloss on the idea behind the project. He says that he wants to congruere apographum meum autographo Wenceslino, to unite, congruere, to bring together my transcription, apographum meum, with the Wenceslas original, the autographo Wenceslino. So he's interested in this sense of merging or bringing together two things he also seems to understand as slightly different projects. So I think it's not so far from what we saw in the Virgil, an object that is consciously trying to merge forms of reproduction, the sort of grafting of a diplomatic transcription onto a kind of critical facsimile. Hybridity is overtly one of the volume's main concerns. So if we return now to the Virgil, there, the prefatory illustration of a few lines of the manuscript, I think, does some similar work to the fold-out engraving of the Golden Bull, though the effect is less one of directly remediated equivalencies and more one of general defamiliaration. I'll explain what I mean. So the special letter forms that we talked about earlier, right, the A, the U, and the Y, they, I think, serve as visual reminders of the manuscript's appearance, which has, of course, been reproduced for us in small fragment. I think they invite the reader in part to use their imaginations to substitute the entire set of manuscript letter forms for the normal Roman capitals. So for this typical P, you might go ahead and imagine the manuscript's slightly more distinctive P, and so on. Not so unlike the strange spacing of the Golden Bull, the constant intrusion of these alien letter forms in the Virgil that even to me sometimes look a little misregistered or misaligned just because of how oddly sort of oversized their appearance is. It defamiliarizes the entire page. Their presence refuses to allow the reader to relax into this work, as if they are reading just another 18th century edition of Virgil. Furthermore, the handwritten corrections and rubrications, remember these kind of guys here, reinscribe the manuscript form back into the printed object. In a sense, the hybridity of the Virgil's aims of reproduction, so we want a readable text, but we also want to depict the manuscript's material embodiment, are mirrored in the duality of its conditions of production. This is an artifact that requires both print and manuscript to exist. So what I think we see here is the way the handwritten corrections draw attention to the insufficiency of print alone, right? In fact, it's really hard to imagine, if this was your plan, how you would render these crossouts just using print, right? It's very difficult. And by extension, I think, it invites us to think about the insufficiency of surrogacy itself. This object only works with the help of manuscript on several levels. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to just offer a few reflections on why I think these objects are worth the kind of time and attention I've been giving them today, and to think a little more generally about some of the ways in which they kind of invite us to read and think differently about the idea of the facsimile. So I would first claim that both of these facsimiles prompt, perhaps necessitate, new ways of reading, ways unlike reading just a printed book or just a manuscript book, ways perhaps unlike even how we read a modern facsimile. These objects require the reader to constantly pivot between manuscript and print, to maintain an awareness of both media simultaneously, to sort of hold them together in suspension. They ask the reader, we might also say, to remain hyper-conscious of materiality. Materiality is never the background of these objects. It is constantly and intrusively the foreground. So print does not subsume the materiality of the manuscript as it might in a true diplomatic transcription. Diplomatic transcription, you're not really going to forget that you're reading a printed book. Conversely, the manuscript never even temporarily subsumes the printedness of facsimile as it might momentarily, and if you're working with particularly one of these, say, deluxe luxury facsimiles today. So to put it more theoretically, these typographic facsimiles engage in a form of what we might call hypermediacy, an interactive evocation of multiple forms of media. What they don't do is what J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin call the, quote, logic of transparent immediacy, when one media attempts to conceal itself fully as it imitates another. And this might be the kind of most extreme example of this we might think of as forgery, something that totally hides its true material origins in an attempt to present the material it's trying to imitate. Another way to put this would be to say that these objects redirect the work of remediation, this movement between media, from a condition of production to a condition of consumption. The reader is actively involved in the process of remediation rather than coming to an object that has already been remediated. The reader becomes the agent of remediation. So these objects make the mechanisms that guide their reproduction an explicit part of the experience of engaging with them. These are objects, we might say, that teach us how to read them, that involve us dynamically in the process of making them legible. This conspicuous remediation is accomplished through the privileging of approximation over exactitude, analogy over imitation, this kind of movement between the two languages of manuscript and print, we might say. In this sense, these objects revel in their status as partial or incomplete. They don't hide the fact that they are insufficient replacements for their antecedents. If anything, the hybridity of their designs only works by virtue of acknowledging this fact. These objects recall the absent original while never trying to fully replace it. Even if both editors concede in their prefaces that practical limitations guide their approaches, they also celebrate their approaches as inventive compromises that showcase not only what print cannot do, but also what it can. Thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome. So we've got at least a few minutes here for a couple of questions once Jane comes over here. Oh, you're totally fine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the questions as they are asked, so just get ready for me to butcher anything that you try to say, and hopefully we can get it addressed. Any questions out there? Comments? Yes, Ellen?
Hi. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. It just piqued all kinds of thinking in my mind. Aura of surrogacy.
So the question was about introducing the concept of surrogate in relationship to the facsimile, and it was to ask Jane to sort of think about how introducing surrogacy in relationship to the facsimile might be a way of sort of teasing out some of the particularities that she's interested in.
Thanks so much for that question. I think you're exactly sort of picking up on the very questions I'm interested in, and I think, in some ways, the sort of short answer to your very good question is just yes. By which I mean, absolutely. I think to understand how these projects are working, it involves sort of absolutely, in some ways I think, and this can be also my own sort of journey of trying to find the kind of terminology that makes sense of these objects, because I do find whenever people talk about this, you will introduce one term and there's always a kind of, maybe not quite in this way, except sort of in that sense. And I think that's partly what I was trying to really articulate is, in some ways we perhaps don't actually have a good vocabulary to really describe what these objects are up to, because precisely as you're saying, they seem to be trying to do a combination of things that aren't necessarily illegible to us or difficult to fully understand, but the precise way they're doing it and how they're doing it doesn't really conform to any precise mechanisms we have today for how those things are accomplished. But you've brought up, I think, one important aspect that I didn't really get into that's certainly worth saying, which is these are also, I think, objects about providing a kind of access. Clearly, part of the motivation here is to take something singular, unique, hard to see, hard to find, hard to get to, and give it some kind of public face. And what I think we see here are also creative ways of thinking about how to make that possible. That it's not enough to just say, oh, this is a text of Virgil's works and it's just replicating the text from these manuscripts. Exactly as you said, the aura, and Benjamin comes up very often when people are thinking about facsimiles, but the sense of trying to give a larger audience some taste, some part of the really difficult to reproduce experience of handling these kind of original objects. And so I think that's absolutely what's going on here. Yeah, sure.
All the way in the middle and the back there.
Yes, I was wondering how much you think this contributes or is part of the rise.
So it's a question about the impact of increasing globalization in this period on, and beyond that, on what exactly the facsimile is up to, what sort of impact that has.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Partly I think there's a piece we won't fully know. I mean, because we have so little kind of archival information about the conditions around which these objects were produced. It's hard to say. I think, again, certainly access is part of that. And it would be interesting to look further at other kinds of repositories. My research has been really focused on North America and the UK. It would be interesting to see if these books turn up. I mean, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything, but it would be interesting to see how far these books turn up, in a sense. How far were they circulating? I don't know the answer to that question yet. I certainly think that would fit. That's the kind of corollary to this idea of wanting to also exhibit the kind of great wealth of Florence. This allows that to become a kind of portable experience. Okay, you maybe can't come to Florence, you can't see all our awesome manuscripts. Here's a little taste, though, of the kind of awesome things we have in Florence. The other part of globalization I think would be relevant is to say that certainly getting into the 18th century, this is also a period where, this starts in the 17th, but there's a growing excitement about really expanding a sense of knowledges of language and alphabets that exist in the world. And I think this interest and excitement and kind of contact with and the study of languages that far kind of go beyond the reach of Europe, that certainly crops up in facsimile editions. And certainly in facsimile illustration are places where we find this just sort of excitement in rendering, oh, here's an alphabet you've probably never seen before. I'm going to show you what it looks like on this, rare sort of manuscript I got from South America or something like that.
So I've got time for one more quick question before we adjourn to our reception, right there in the back, or middle back.
Thanks. You touched really quickly on exactness to use.
It's a question about thinking about how it is that the explicit fake or forgery or the apocryphal document helps us think a bit more precisely about what exactly the boundaries of a facsimile might be.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a question that comes up quite a bit, actually. And you might have gleaned a little bit from that opening quotation from Carter and Barker that there is the sense in which the sort of specter of the forgery haunts the facsimile. And I think you're exactly right to think about this problem of exactness as sort of part of that. Something I think is interesting is in sort of kind of mid-20th century to late 20th century debates around the facsimile. You see a sort of, on the one hand, bibliographers really pushing for exact copy, whatever that means, to really be a kind of limiting case for what can count as a facsimile. That it has to be exact in these ways. That, of course, then seems to provoke, though, a whole other kind of anxiety, which is if you really want your facsimiles to be exact, they really start to seem like they might be forgeries. But I think part of your question that's really interesting, that I need to think more about, really, is also the way in which exactness can be a kind of way of sort of establishing canonical or accepted text, the way that can function as a kind of barometer for thinking about that. And yeah, and I think it's something that people have thought a lot about in the context of print. People have thought quite a bit about there are these cases of, well, when does something cease to be just a kind of copy that's meant to be a sort of sense that, yes, you do this really well. The Aldine forgeries are a famous example of this. They're a sign of how Aldous was so good at what he was doing, but when do they actually start to become just downright forgeries? And how can we use them as ways of reading or understanding the cultural value that the appearance of certain kinds of objects have? And that's, I guess, what I'm really interested in, would be maybe sort of translating your idea about apocryphal text into almost apocryphal visual. What does it mean to take that and think about the way it is implicated in the material construction of a text, not just in the text itself? And it's honestly something I want to think more about, but it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Well, with that, let's thank Jane and adjourn to our reception.